whereas John McCain has not addressed them at all.
Well, as we continue to look at issues regarding the 2008 presidential race, we turn to political journalist, nationally syndicated columnist David Sirota. His first book, Hostile Takeover, was a Times bestseller. His latest book, just published, is called Uprising, an unauthorized tour of the populist revolt scaring Wall Street and Washington. David Sirota, welcome to Democracy Now!
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Why do you think there's an uprising going on in this country?
Well, you look at the major social indices right now, and people are really angry, and you can see it in the polling, you can see it in market research. And I think what's really interesting right now is that we're seeing a level of anger and a level of disaffection, not just with the government, but with major other institutions in society. Gallup's poll shows that the anger in the country rivals, in terms of anti-government anger or dissatisfaction with the government, rivals that of the late 1970s. What's different is that there is an increase in anger at corporate America, at big business, at banks, at the financial system. And I think that means that gives us a real opportunity, progressives, a real opportunity to take this momentary uprising and explode it into a full-fledged political and social movement. The danger is, of course, is that the anger could go into a right-wing direction. In the late 1970s, you had a moment where you had after Watergate, Jimmy Carter came in, was elected, his administration didn't really go anywhere, and the uprising of that post-Watergate era really didn't end. Instead, it intensified, and Ronald Reagan and the conservative movement came along and took advantage of it and exploded it into the conservative movement that we're living under. And so we're really at a moment here where it could go in a progressive direction or it could go in a conservative direction.
You know, in terms of that, I mean, it's clear that there is an enormous public dissatisfaction, but the question in my mind as to whether the dissatisfaction has manifested itself in organized popular movements is the real, because there's an enormous energy now behind the political campaigns, but I don't see that much street or grassroots energy in terms of organized groups that are battling sort of an independent or progressive direction.
Well, I think we're in this middle ground here. The uprising, as I describe it, is sort of that middle stage between disengagement and chaos and a real organized social movement. So what I did was in the book, I went around the country and looked at who is organizing around this, both politically and equally as importantly in terms of direct action. And so I went everywhere from Seattle with workers who were trying to organize Microsoft workers into a union. I went snuck into the ExxonMobil shareholder meeting with shareholder activists who were filing shareholder resolutions against Exxon and other corporations. I went to the California-Mexican border, which is the sort of right-wing expression of this populist moment. I went with the Minutemen. I was here in New York with the Working Families Party, which has used the fusion voting system here in New York and is trying to use it in where it exists in other states to fuel this uprising. I certainly agree with you. The question is whether this election and the focus on the election is going to deter from creating a real social movement. Barack Obama, in particular, is portraying himself as a social movement unto himself. And I understand why he's trying to do that. He's trying to win the election. But the issue is whether the country and whether this uprising will think that if he is elected, the work of the uprising, the work of creating a social movement is over, rather than what the election really should be, which is a beginning point.
David Sirota, you talk about conflicts of interest within the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement, which enjoys widespread support, and the politicians who ally themselves with pro-war consultants.
Right. What happened in the chapter that I reported on the anti-war movement is back in 2007. What we found is that you just had an election where the Democrats were elected promising to end the war. And what ended up happening was that the same Democratic Congress refused to really do what it takes to actually end the war. And part of that was, I think, a strategic decision on behalf of the anti-war organizations in Washington about how they said we could end the war. You had consultants who were simultaneously being paid by the Democratic Party and Democratic Party politicians. You had Hildebrand Tooze, you had consulting firms. They were the lead consulting firm. And I don't mean to pick on them. It's just that they were the consulting firm that was heading up the major coalition in Washington of anti-war groups. And so the strategy that came out of those anti-war groups was we have to simply bash the Republicans to end the war, when in fact, of course, Congress was controlled entirely by Democrats. Last I checked, Democrats have 41 senators in the U.S. Senate if they wanted to filibuster a bill to continue funding the war. They haven't done that, yet the strategy kept saying, well, we have to only focus the ads, the media buys, and the pressure on Republicans. It was sort of a dishonest strategy, and I think it had something to do with the fact that you have organizations in Washington that put partisan affinity over movement goals.
You mentioned earlier this whole effort to organize a Microsoft or white-collar workers. What are the unions that are doing that? What kind of success have they had? And what kind of impact could this have long-term in terms of the U.S. labor movement?
I spent my time with a union called WashTech, Washington Alliance of Technology Workers, that are affiliated with the Communication Workers of America. WashTech, in their efforts to unionize Microsoft, has found that though the company has executives who, wear khakis and are more casually dressed, those executives are equally as anti-union as the Walmarts of the world and as of the other anti-union companies of the world. They've had a very difficult time at Walmart. However, the effort to unionize high-tech workers has had success in other places. WashTech has unionized locally there an AT&T call center. CWA in general has had success, is having increasing success, but what they found is that this anti-union, anti-labor ethos in corporate America does not stop in Silicon Valley, does not stop in the high-tech world, and of course this is a growing segment of the economy. So what I said in the book was the reason I looked at particularly high-tech workers and that part of the economy is because it's so ununionized right now, and it's a growing part of our economy, and the question of the labor movement's future has at least a little bit to do, in fact a lot to do, with whether that sector of the economy can be unionized.
We're talking to David Sirota. The Uprising, an unauthorized tour of the populist revolt scaring Wall Street and Washington is his book. Talk about the history of superdelegates.
Yeah, this is a really important thing that we've heard a lot about superdelegates now, and people haven't really asked, well, why was it set up? Why was the superdelegate system set up? Well, the basic history is that after the 1968 convention, when there was a lot of violence and people were unhappy with who was nominated. Remember, Hubert Humphrey didn't run in a single primary, and he was nominated at the convention to be the Democrats' nominee, and people were upset that he wasn't more vociferously against the war in Vietnam. And so what happened was there was a reform commission between then the 68 election and the 72 election that opened up the process, that said that there wasn't going to be these backroom deals to anoint a nominee. We're not going to have another nominee that never runs in a primary. And what ended up happening was George McGovern was nominated. And George McGovern went on to lose the 1972 election by a huge margin. And what ended up happening was, as I say in the book, is that this McGovern fable was created. The party elders who didn't like the fact that the process had been opened up because it threatened their power created this idea that the reason George McGovern lost was because he was nominated by the public's will. He was chosen by the public, and they needed elders to pick a more quote-unquote electable candidate. And so eventually a superdelegate quote-unquote system was set up to reassert the power of the party elders. So in other words, the superdelegates literally exist specifically to prevent the will of the people from being expressed in the nomination process. And I might add, what's really kind of sad and funny about it is that these are the same superdelegates who gave us President Dukakis, President Mondale, President Kerry, et cetera, et cetera. Point being is that the idea that party elders are such strategists that they know how to pick better nominees than the people hasn't really been borne out.
But explain again who they are and who chooses them.
Right. They are party officials. They are elected politicians, oftentimes former elected politicians. What they do is, and I think it's about 40% of what you need as a presidential candidate to win the nomination are superdelegates, people who have more power, for instance, than the entire primary of New York and California, right? So you have essentially a group of people who may be elected inside the party structure, but have no obligation to the mass public's voting in these primaries.
But on the other, the argument that, for instance, let's say your average senator or congressman, or all senators or congressmen are superdelegates automatically. Right. Their argument is, well, I've already been elected as a member of the House of Representatives or the United States Senate. Why should I now have to run as a delegate? Because the voters have already chosen me as the leader of the party. Why shouldn't I have an automatic seat as a delegate to the convention?